see the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.
Hi, it's Edwin Rutsch from the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, and today I'm here with Lorraine Segal, who's a conflict coach and a trainer and a mediator specializing in transforming communication and conflict for parents, teens, and others. And you teach conflict resolution classes through extended education at Sonoma State, I see here on your website. And the way I kind of got in contact with you is, I do a daily search on articles and blogs on empathy. So I came across your website called Conflict Remedy, and you'd done a whole series of articles on empathy. So I was really interested in interviewing you about that. Would you like to say anything more about yourself by way of introduction?
Yes. Well, just first, it's been lovely to connect with you, and empathy is definitely a central part of the work that I do and part of my own journey as well. Well, the blog posts you're talking about, one was called Babies, Bullies, and the Birth of Empathy, about this lovely program called Roots of Empathy that brings babies into classrooms. And I also wrote a post about conflict resolution, empathy, and the fourth dimension, about a sci-fi version of finding empathy by entering into the minds and hearts of others. So in terms of myself, I kind of came to this conflict resolution work. Well, it's been part of my life path. I think that empathy for me started when I was a little girl reading novels of Jane Austen and science fiction and history, because I really love to enter imaginatively into the worlds of other people whose cultures were different, whose ideas were different, and whose struggles were different and yet the same. And then as I got older, I became an English as a second language teacher after traveling to different cultures. And it's so interesting. For me, part of that interplay of empathy is between the ways we're all alike and also understanding the real differences that can create barriers to communication or lead to assumptions we make. Because if we assume everyone's just like us and they do something we think is wrong, then we think they're bad, instead of understanding that they have different cultural assumptions that they're working from. So I really loved my ESL students, and they taught me so much. But I was, as I told you, when I was a tenured professor at a community college for many years, and the politics and the ways that they dealt with conflict were so dysfunctional and actually, I'd say evil. And I had to participate in some mediations that were so awful and soul destroying that I said there has to be a better way to deal with conflict, and found a program to get a certificate in conflict resolution, and then left my tenured position to start my own business, and now also teach at Sonoma State. So that's kind of where I'm coming from with the work that I do.
Mm-hmm. Well, what I'm looking at is how we can build a culture of empathy, and it seems to me that conflict resolution is like core to that. It's like conflict resolution is pretty much based on empathy, or it can be based on empathy and bringing people together and getting them to empathize with each other. So does that? So maybe if we want a culture of empathy, I think maybe we should be teaching conflict resolution in the schools and everywhere.
I couldn't agree with you more. Yes. And the work I do, I started, my original training in conflict resolution was as a facilitator years ago. And then I started doing mediations, first as a volunteer and then in the community for money. And I love doing mediations where you create a safe place for people to sit down and talk to each other. But I actually even more love coaching people and training them, because if if I can help them get the skills to understand themselves and others with compassion and clarity, then sometimes the conflicts, they're totally able to resolve themselves and don't need a mediator or never go there in the first place because they've built that empathy and compassion. So I agree with you that everyone, it's good to teach little children, of course, but in the corporate world, in nonprofits, in schools, everywhere that there are groups of people and there's conflict because it's an inevitable part of life. Learning to be more empathic, learning these kinds of communication and understanding skills are key. So that's my passion for this work.
Yeah. So
And
yeah, you've got a real
I was just
passion
saying, I
for
write a blog.
conflict. Oh, yeah, you've got a real passion for conflict resolution. What do you see as the problems in society, and what would a culture of empathy look like and address those problems?
Well, I think part of how I would say it is that each of us have our own story. It's the narrative that we tell ourselves about ourselves and our life and other people. And we tend to see other people as sort of bit players when we're the star. And what happens with empathy, or a way of looking at why we need to build empathy, is that we're each the star of our own story. We each have our narrative. We each have a story we're telling ourselves about our lives and about other people. And we make so many false assumptions based on why we think people are doing something, what we think their motive is. And most of the time we're wrong. We don't have a clue about other people, and sometimes we don't even have a clue about ourselves. And so the more we can understand that there's many truths, many stories, many ways of looking at the world, and move away from that dichotomy of right, wrong, I'm right, you're wrong, only one of us can be right, and understand that we're all right together because we're coming from our own lives and understandings, and we can reach across that divide. That is how we create a culture of empathy, I believe, in at least my attempts in my small corner of the world to start that process.
So you're seeing that we all have these stories, and of our own life, about our own lives, and we have stories about others, and that those stories are not always accurate.
Exactly. Or they're all true and all not true at the same time. They're all limited. And so a lot of my work is well, how do we help people move beyond their own narrow stories to empathically enter into the reality of another person? And one of the huge skills, this will not be a surprise to you, Edwin, at all, is listening. And it's sometimes called active listening, compassionate listening, empathic listening, listening to understand. But the idea is that we set aside our own story and listen to someone else. And when I teach people about this, I start by talking about the myths about listening, because people think that listening means agreeing or accepting, or they think that listening means that then if you listen to someone, you have to do what they want. And it's not only individuals, but actually governments that make this mistake. The US, instead of using diplomacy to sit down and talk with people and understand them, won't sit down with them unless they've agreed to certain things ahead of time. So when people learn to set aside those judgments and not be thinking about how they're going to counter what the person said, not be thinking about what they're going to say next, not be thinking about whether they agree with them, but just really try to understand what they're saying, it is an amazing and powerful tool for healing communication and conflict. And I have seen this vividly in mediations. People think they're arguing about money or child custody or a property line between neighbors. And often I have seen that these issues that felt so huge, when we create a safe place for people to simply listen to each other, half of the work is already done. And then they're willing to be open to other options of looking at solutions because we've looked at the feelings and they feel respected and heard and understood. And the power of that is absolutely immense. And sometimes that's all you need, is to truly listen. And the problem goes away. Because you're not seeing the other as the enemy or someone who's doing something to you, but back to that idea of story, someone who's living their own life as best they can and not realizing the impact that it has on the other person. So
do you have any anecdotes about that, like something that happened that you can share, like some, any conflicts that you saw and how they developed through listening?
Yes. Well, here's one example of a mediation that I did between a landlord and a tenant, where the tenant had moved out, but there was all this anger and misunderstanding about should they get their security deposit back or not. And so on the surface, it was just about money. But what happened was, as they listened to each other, and the tenant got to say how horrible it was to be without a kitchen for 3 months, which was what had happened because of some damages and problems. And the landlord got to say how hard she had tried to fix things, and how badly she felt, and how she hadn't understood the impact of they didn't understand the impact of the other, and they didn't understand all the good faith efforts that the other person had made. And when they got that, when they really heard each other, that these were two good people doing the best they could who had a conflict or a clash, they resolved the money issues in about 5 minutes. That the mediation was 2 hours, and the money, what they presented with, was resolved in 5 minutes. So
So it sounds like the problem there is both sides felt unheard.
Yes, that's a big piece of it. And one of the other issues that relates to listening that I work a lot with on people is about hot buttons. I don't know if you're familiar with that term. They're sometimes called emotional triggers or flashpoints. And one of the things that goes along with people's narratives is, okay, someone does something that we just feel like we're going to explode, or we feel really hurt in the moment. And what people don't understand is that isn't all about the other person. It's about us. So I do this internal hot button process that I train people in, where first they look at their hot buttons, and then what they do, the second part is, what's the story that they're telling themselves about the other person, why they did that. So I'll give you a funny example. Whenever I do the dishes at home and put them in the dish drainer, my wife would come in and rearrange the dishes in the dish drainer afterwards. And I would be incredibly angry that she had done that. And the reason was the story I was telling myself about why she did that was that she thought I was stupid or incompetent, that I couldn't even put the dishes properly in the dish drainer to let them dry. So that then the third part is asking myself, okay, why is this so intense? Has this happened before with another person? Has it happened repeatedly with this person? And in my case, this was something my mother did to me over and over and over and over and over and over when I was a kid. So, of course, it had this huge charge that had nothing to do with the moment. It was about my history and my past. And so I was making up a story about her, about my wife, based on my past. And then the fourth stage of this is, okay, can you put a more benevolent interpretation on what the person is doing? So in my case, I've been married for a long time, so I could ask her, what's up? Why are you doing this? Well, it was about stuff from her childhood. It had nothing to do with me. And my heart softened and opened. And sometimes it still irritates me when she does it, but now I get it why. So by separating my story and her story, I was able to really find empathy for her struggle and to know that it wasn't anything about my competence. It was about her past. And it's a process I've used many times with clients to help them look at their part. And you can't do it without listening, but you can also do it by just what I call imaginative empathy. Some people, if I'm driving a car and a person in front of me is going really slowly, I don't get to talk to them and ask them why, but I could either think they're really stupid and getting in my way, or I can say, well, maybe they're lost or looking for a street number. It's a choice that I can make. And teaching people how to choose that more empathic choice also makes a big difference, I think, in conflicts.
So it's like when we're seeing something that's kind of aggravating us or getting us mad or frustrating us or whatever, there's a story that we're kind of telling about that experience. And then what you're saying is, well, create a new story around that.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
And first, actually, it's looking at our own past as well to understand inside ourselves why this event, this small action or small thing that someone said has such a huge impact on us. So that sort of self-knowledge with the compassion for the other person and understanding of the other person can really transform relationships and conflict.
Well, you mentioned imaginative empathy, which got me thinking about the definition of empathy. And the definition I've kind of come up with is kind of empathy is of four parts, kind of a self-empathy, kind of self-awareness, sensory awareness, mindfulness of oneself. And then the other is kind of this mirrored empathy through mirror neurons. So as I'm seeing you now, I saw you shake your head slightly, and I could feel that kind of acknowledgement, the feeling of acknowledgement. And then there's the third part, which the academics call it perspective taking or cognitive empathy, but I kind of like the term imaginative empathy, and I heard that from you too, where you're imagining yourself in the position of another, taking a different perspective, kind of as an actor might. And then the fourth part being empathic action, which is kind of like when you were in that conflict with your partner, with your wife, it's like, okay, we've got this problem over the dish drainer. And it's like, what are we going to do now? How are we going to act together? And kind of that part is I've seen in conflict resolution, what I just call empathic action, where you work smoothly together, where kind of the blocks to empathy are removed, the disconnection. So I was just wondering how that, definition kind of resonates, with your definition.
Yes, I haven't said it that way myself, but every piece of what you're talking about makes total sense to me and is part of what's necessary to really heal relationships and resolve conflicts. And the last part, I call that the creative problem solving aspect, that once you're understanding each other and let me add one thing to that. There's a perspective that I wrote a blog post about this also called good conflict, bad conflict. And the bad kind of conflict is when I'm saying you're bad, you did something terrible, you're bad, or I'm bad. It's about that relationship conflict. But then there's another kind of conflict where we have the same goal, but we just have different ideas about how to get there. And that's a very creative process, whether it's about a dish drainer or a project that you're doing with a team at work. And it's part of what mediators do and coaches do, is to help people see what they actually have in common. For example, when parents and custody issues or guardianship issues that I've done, if we can help them both connect with their mutual love of the children, then there's a basis for creative problem solving instead of seeing each other as the enemy, someone who's trying to hurt you or hurt the children. So I think all those parts are important. Our minds, our bodies, our spirits, our souls.
Yeah, it's that last part. I think that a lot of people don't realize that empathy really has a real creative component to it. That as people come together, that you can start working and creating together. And that's really like a lot of the fun for me of empathy is that creative kind of problem solving. And I've heard one definition of empathy as being when the blocks to action are removed that don't exclude. So it's like, when you're kind of working together and something's not working, there's some kind of a block to that action, that there's that somewhere there's been a lack of empathy and connection that's kind of happened. And that's what that block is kind of a lack of empathy. And you need to kind of go back and find and empathize with each other around what that block is.
Yes. And what that makes me think about, Edwin, is something, there's one of my mentors in the field wrote a book called Mediating Dangerously. And it's about asking those deeper questions, challenging people to really look inside and to step beyond their comfort zone in figuring out how to reach out empathically. And one of the things I do with people, and how I frame it depends on where they're at, but I actually use prayer and affirmations for the other person as a way to get through that block that you're talking about, and empathy. So, for example, I was working, I'll give you two examples actually here. I was working with a woman who was being bullied at work by one of her coworkers. And she was out on stress leave. It had gotten so intense. And the workplace wasn't calling me in. So I was only working with the one person. So we worked on it from a number of aspects. How could she get support for herself? How could she feel more centered? What was she doing that she could do differently to protect herself? And could she find any empathy for this person, even though this person was treating her horribly? So I actually had her say a prayer for the person every day of wishing. There's a prayer I kind of learned and made up about, please grant her everything I want for myself, including spiritual, emotional, and physical healing. Grant her, I used to say, when I start, I would say, because she really needs it. And then I would get to the point of just freely wishing them everything. And I had this man who was struggling with his ex-wife over custody issues. He's not a spiritual person particularly, so we just called it sending good thoughts to her every day. And for both these very different people in very different situations, it worked miracles for them. And I think it really is about, I have a personal belief in the divine, but it's not really about that. It's about becoming bigger inside yourself and finding that way to embrace the other, to realize that they're a struggling human being just as we are. So that's an extra tool that I've found very helpful for people.
So that might be about judgment, in a sense that, if you're judging the others, that it kind of like shrinks your awareness and kind of that prayer. I don't know, that's how I'm kind of interpreting it. It's like it kind of opens you up and makes you more able to empathize.
Yes, exactly. I think it helps open your heart, or just to just and you don't have to believe it when you're doing it, but just the act of wishing good for the other person, it does open our hearts, and our spirits, and expands. Yes.
Well, I'm looking at like how do we build a culture of empathy, kind of making it kind of it's a bit of a mission for me in terms of how do we transform society so that we kind of raise the empathy level within society. And to do that, it seems like we need to start with the intention. It's like people have to have the intention to want to do that. Do you have any thoughts about how do we create an intention that people say, yeah, I really want to create this, raise the level of empathy in my life and in society?
Yes. Well, I think that I actually would go back before. I don't think people even know they can have that intention, or enter into that until they feel supported and loved themselves. If it's okay, I'm going to give you an example from a workshop that I did recently.
I love these stories that you do share. So I'd love to hear as many stories as you have to tell, because I really enjoy them.
Bless you, Edwin. Thank you. I love telling the stories. That's what I do in my blog a lot too, is tell the stories, because sometimes I do it when I'm a teacher too. I call it telling stories on myself, because if I'm willing to reveal things about me, it makes people feel safer to do that themselves. So it is part of how I see building that culture. If we step up and take the risk, then we inspire others to as well. So I did a workshop. As you know, I do work in the workplace, and I also work with parents and teens. And a principal of a local high school asked me to come and do a presentation, and I was a bit nervous about it because it was for a group of ninth graders who had failed, and their parents. So here they were, everyone feeling shamed and horrible, the parents that they failed the kids that they failed. And it wasn't a happy picture to start with. And I only had an hour with them. And the idea was for me to help them communicate better. And my secret goal was to help them love each other more so they could support each other, so the kids felt safer to take risks, to be successful, to, do whatever it took. So I started by saying, being a teenager is one of the most difficult jobs in the world, and the only other one that's as difficult is being a parent of a teenager. And, what I did was I said, and I'm sure there's 10 other places you'd rather to be, and 15 other reasons you'd rather be there than, to be in a meeting why your kids were failing a ninth grade. And so what I did was I started by offering empathy to them. And what I was saying, I didn't use these words. What I was really saying is, you're all good people. You're all okay. Yes, there's a problem here, but you're not at fault. You're not a bad person, because, we just don't hear that enough. And as I said to them, if we feel like we're being scolded or attacked, we curl in a tight little ball like an armadillo or a, potato bug or something. And we're not open. Our hearts aren't open to someone else, we're just too busy defending ourselves from being a pile of bleep. And so what I was doing with these parents was first trying to create an environment where they felt like they were good enough. Once I helped them feel like they were okay, then the next thing I did was have them practice listening. And I told them that they could not work with their own family until the very end of the workshop, because we have so many patterns and assumptions and judgments and habits of negative communication that we can get into, and it's easier to break those habits with someone else. So I had them work with someone they didn't know, who wasn't their family member, and practice some very simple listening skills. And then the next thing I did was I called it Ask the Expert, where I put parents and teens together, not from their own family, and they got to ask anything that they wanted, to help them understand their kids or their parents. And then at the very end, I had them talk to their own family and say something that they valued about their parent or their child. And we went from this in the hour, they ended up hugging and crying and kissing each other. And we went in an hour from this very tight, tense, kind of hostile environment to this incredibly loving place. And the last thing was an action plan for how they were going to help their kids or what they were going to do. But that's creative problem solving, but they've got to feel the love and feel like they're okay and understand the other person's doing the best they can before you can get there.
Yeah. So what I was hearing, it starts with kind of filling up people's empathy batteries themselves, in a sense, right?
Oh, that's wonderful.
It's like we all need empathy, and that somehow we need a core of people who are there to kind of start the prime the pump, in a sense, more right, the metaphors, because it's like and I've seen that in conflict mediation too, is there's two people who are disputants and they're all mad at each other, as you were talking about, and you start with the mediator actually empathizing with both sides. So it's like they're starting to feel heard, they're starting to fill that empathy battery. So as that empathy battery gets kind of full, right, they're able to discharge a little bit, to the other people, in the conflict. And then it kind of, then it becomes like a mutual charge or something. I'm really going wild with this metaphor, but it's really,
oh, I love it.
It's really like, how do you get the prime the pump? Because everybody's stressed, right? It's like there's so much stress, and it's almost like you need a daily dose of empathy to, from someone to kind of get charged. I've noticed that in myself, that if I've had a lot of empathy, someone really listening to me, that I feel fuller and more spacious, and I have more space for that active listening that you were talking about.
Yes. Okay, you might see this in a new blog post, because I love your image about the empathy battery and filling it up. I think that's totally true, because if we feel loved, if we feel okay, then we can offer it to others. And sometimes people open their hearts to others first and then be able to give it to themselves. It's more a cycle than a linear, but it's absolutely important. And there's a related concept this makes me think of that I wrote a blog post about. I called it giving yourself emergency self-compassion. It's from Marshall Rosenberg, who and I love the idea of, if you're in a dispute with someone or a conversation and you feel wounded or little or whatever, and they're not getting it, they're just not understanding it, you can still give yourself emergency self-compassion. And I called it being it's not just a Band-Aid, it's being a first responder to your own emotional emergency. And then you can find a calm place to listen to the other person, even if they're not giving you what you need in the moment. So, but we do need it from somewhere. Sometimes we can give it to ourselves or find it in nature or by, self-care. And sometimes we absolutely need it from other people.
Yeah, so somehow we need kind of that charge our own battery, right? It's like
Yes.
It's like, what is it that charges your own battery? Maybe all the things like, a bit of solitude or meditation or like you were saying, with just positive, kind of positive words for yourself.
All right, now I'm wanting to go wild with your analogy and think, in Sonoma County, they've started setting up electric charging stations for cars, etc. So part of our life work is finding out where our charging stations are for our, for me, it's taking walks, and I drum for a sacred chanting group at a synagogue. Um, and sometimes for me, it fills me up to give empathy to other people, because it gets me, like this workshop that I was telling you about, Edwin, when they were hugging each other at the end. Oh my goodness, did that charge my batteries, that I was able to help them find that love for each other and express it, coming from, being mad at each other for the failure. And I find that tremendously gratifying, and I feel sort of humbly grateful to be a witness and to be part of it and to be able to use my skills in a way that helps them feel that empathy for themselves and others.
So what I'm hearing there, my question was about how do we get the intention for kind of building a culture of empathy, and then you went back to saying, well, people need to feel it first.
Right.
They need to get a visceral sense of what it's about. And then we kind of explored like different ways of, charging your own empathy battery. But there's another part to it too, is, I've seen that like a mediator or a therapist will like empathize with people that they're working with, but they don't name it. They don't say, this is empathy and we need to make more of it. It's like they get a dose of it, and there's not a kind of a cognitive part around that. There's not like a map of what it is that we're doing. And it seems that that part needs to be kind of filled in, that like when mediators are mediating, they're saying, we're building a culture of empathy here. You know what I mean? So yes. The process is named because it goes unnamed. So it seems to me.
Yes. Well, I think part of it is, we have to, part of being empathic and doing this work is we have to meet people where they are in terms of a language that they can hear. So if I said, okay, the purpose of this mediation is to build empathy, they're going to say, screw that. That's not what people think they want. If I had said to the people in this workshop at the beginning, my purpose is to help you love each other, they would be going, huh? We're in the library at the school. Why are you doing that? So I don't think there's anything wrong with having a secret intention that's benign and getting there. I'll give you one other, and I think that's why I kind of went around in a circle from your saying of setting the intention. I am setting the intention, absolutely, always setting the intention to help people build empathy and understanding and forgiveness. But it's not a language. I mean, maybe when you've been doing this work, Edwin, for another 20 years, the language will be more part of the mainstream and accepted, and we can use it directly. At this point, it's the intention. But one of the things that I do before I go into a mediation or a coaching session or a training, or I did it before this interview also, is that I ask to be a channel of, I say the goddess, a channel of the goddess's wisdom and compassion. And in a mediation or training to create an environment where people can hear each other and forgive each other, and that healing may happen. Well, I never tell anybody in the mediation or the coaching session that I'm doing that. But recently I went to Sonoma State to be on a panel for people who were in the conflict resolution program, and they like graduates to come and talk about the work they do. And for some reason, I felt moved to say that I did that at the beginning of a mediation. And it turned out that every single person on the panel did something like that, and we had never talked about it. One of the women, she would hold the door frame, literally, and ask that as she walked through that she be able to be of service to them. And someone else on the panel did a 10-minute silent meditation before he came in to be at perfect peace within himself. And it was as if we were sort of closet spiritual mediators, but we weren't talking about it. And I think that I'm saying this now because I think that there's a way that that's true of empathy as well, that it doesn't feel quite safe to talk openly about empathy in a lot of settings. And I hope that'll change. But my intention around empathy is always at the heart of the work I do.
Yeah, that's my sense too, is that there's like a lack, people feel kind of uncomfortable about talking about empathy. They'll feel, maybe that it gets criticized, that it's weak, or, some people say, oh, it's feminine, or, we need real tough, values, or, I mean, there's all these kind of criticisms. So there's a little bit of a hesitancy to kind of be a real empathy activist and like strongly say, I'm for empathy, damn it, and
Yes.
I'm proud about it. I'm not going to be intimidated to kind of say that. So
Yes. Well, I think baby steps are okay. I've been doing workshops on communication and conflict resolution skills for several years now. And I created this one workshop that felt so risky because it was really spiritual. And I include a guided visualization. I call it Journey to the Heart of Communication. And a lot of it is really about empathy and opening our hearts. And there's 4 parts to this. I call them the chambers, the 4 chambers of the heart, which is listening deeply, speaking your truth gently, embracing imperfection, and letting go. And I think that the empathy is in at least 3 of them. The first one, the listening deeply. We've been talking about how crucial listening is, and how it builds empathy. And the embracing imperfection is, for me, it's this understanding that nothing and no one in this world is perfect. And if we expect ourselves to be perfect, or expect others to be perfect, expect them to meet our needs perfectly, expect ourselves to be perfect business people or perfect parents or, spouses, that it's a resentment or a judgment waiting to happen. So we're all perfectly human, and to embrace that goes a long way to finding that compassion for ourselves and others that enables that deep communication and understanding. And then the 4th part the 4th chamber, the letting go, letting go of expectations, and the piece we haven't talked about that for me is inextricably connected to empathy, which is forgiveness. How do we forgive people? How do we let go of bitterness? And some of it's through understanding. Some of it is through just knowing that the way I say it for myself is, I do not want to have a bitter heart. That is not how I want to live my life. And so I'm committed to letting go of resentments and anger and forgiving people, even people who have truly harmed me, because I do not want the burden of that resentment. I do not want that to be my life. And I work with clients on that as well.
So how do you see the relationship of empathy and forgiveness? Because it's the forgiveness is a big part of your work. There's one quality, for example, that I've seen when people are in conflict and they start seeing, for example, you mentioned that story of the landlord and tenant a while back, and they started seeing what the other person was going through. They had all these judgments and resentments and anger and feelings of conflict, and then they started seeing each other's perspective and what the other person was going through. It seemed to me it was more like they saw each other's humanities and kind of became one, in a sense, through empathy. And I don't know where the forgiveness is. It seems like it's like the resentments kind of melt away, the disconnection, melts away, and connection happens. And so, where is the forgiveness in a situation like that?
Yeah, I think it's partly what you said, that when resentments melt away, when you say, oh, they did that because they were living their life, or they thought it was the right thing to do. It's a lot easier to forgive someone. Well, let me say it this way. We often judge people by their impact on us. And when we understand that their intent was not malicious, it makes it much easier to forgive them. And it is part of empathy. But forgiveness it's a really interesting thing. I think that understanding the other person's perspective, understanding that they're struggling, understanding that they're suffering, which is the empathy, helps us forgive. But I also think that forgiveness is a choice. There's a beautiful video, Edwin, you might have seen it. It's called The Power of Forgiveness. And it's about different groups that chose forgiveness, even under extremely difficult circumstances. Amish, whose children were killed by a gunman, a Holocaust survivor, people in Northern Ireland, and then a man whose son was killed by another man's grandson. And they actually started doing forgiveness and empathy building work together. And in that case, I don't think it's so much building specific empathy for the person as it is making a choice to live in an empathic way, just choosing forgiveness, choosing choosing forgiveness. I'll give you an example from my own life. As I've said, I was a tenured professor at a community college for many years. And for a number of those years, especially the last ones, I was a scapegoat. I was mobbed. I'm a survivor of mass bullying at that place. And the intention of a number of those people was malicious. They really wanted to destroy me, and psychically or professionally. And I still chose forgiveness, not for them, but because I want to live in empathy, taking care of myself. And I did have to leave. It wasn't enough to just forgive them and understand that they were so up. But the part that was empathy was that by praying for them and being willing to entertain the idea of forgiving them, even though what they did was horrible, I was able to have a greater vision of who they were and understand how terribly fearful they were. They were absolutely terrified of change. And I represented change as someone who was progressive, who was creative, who supported unlearning racism work and all kinds of innovation. And they didn't want any of it, even though they were supposed to. And it doesn't mean I wanted to stay there and be abused and keep suffering. But it enabled me to let go of a lot of the bitterness because I got it that these folks were doing the very, very best they could. And it was awful. But it really was the best that they knew how to do with the tools that they had. And so it's a different level of empathy, I think, from really understanding and feeling close to someone, because I don't feel close to these people, but I am able to disconnect from the wound by having that bigger empathy for I am so grateful that I have more tools and I have more support that these people don't have, and they act out of their woundedness.
Yeah, so it sounds like you were just able to let go of kind of the judgments or resentments that you might have had towards them for what they were doing, just saying, I'm just not going to hold on to this because it's not what I want to hold on to. There's like a bigger...
Exactly.
There's a bigger something there. There's a bigger humanity or something, perhaps.
Yes.
There.
And I actually do this work with clients as well, because sometimes they'll tell me about things that, happened at work or happened with an ex-spouse, and it's horrible. And yet I really support and encourage them to still find that bigger empathy, that forgiveness, because their lives will be better. It's enlightened self-interest in an empathic way.
Another question I like is about metaphors of empathy. You can have the definition, like I have this definition model of empathy, kind of 4 parts to it. But you can also, I found, define empathy by a metaphor. And it's commonly the metaphor of standing in someone else's shoes, looking through someone else's eyes. And I was wondering, do you have a metaphor of empathy? Like empathy is like, if it was like an animal or type of land. And I have my own metaphor, and I can just share that. Is for me, empathy is like a cornucopia. So each human being has this cornucopia of feelings, sensations, and you have it, I have it, and through empathy, we're able to kind of share that cornucopia of experiences. Mm-hmm. And so for me, empathy is like a cornucopia. So, and
that's lovely.
I was wondering if you have something like a visual image like that for empathy.
I don't think that I do. I have I have empathy stories. Mm-hmm. I think that that's more how I enter into it. I mean, my vision, I guess, is just an open heart with golden and pink light flowing out of it. So it protects me. So I'm not going to be harmed. It's not, but that I can pour it on people and help them pour it. So.
That works for me. That's a good metaphor. It's like an open golden heart. Uh-huh. Yeah, I like that.
But a lot of the stories I tell in my blog are about ways that I'm trying to build empathy in myself. I have one. It's called Woman Bites Dog. And it's about me walking around the park, and people are supposed to have their dogs on leashes, and they don't. And sometimes I walk really fast, and I've had all these dogs come up to me and start growling. And I finally realized that if I slowed down, the dogs didn't see me, that I was going to attack their human beings the same way. So even though the dogs are supposed to be on a leash, and I could have that judgment or whatever, there was something that I could do, which was to walk very slowly, and then it's been easier with the dogs since. So it's sort of, that's not exactly empathy, but for me, empathy and understanding our own part, where we have power and can impact things, and where we're powerless and have to let go. That's that kind of perspective. I guess that's perspective taking plus empathy is really valuable.
Yeah, I didn't quite. It was like you were empathizing with the dogs there, understanding there is.
Well, it was not. It was more saying, okay, what is happening from the dog's perspective? Mm-hmm. Why is the dog okay? The owners are responsible. They should have the dog on a leash. That's the law in the park. But what is going on with the dogs? And is there anything that I can do? Do I have a part in this? And I realized that the dog was probably trying to protect his humans, and that if I slowed down, they wouldn't see me as a threat. And it's worked.
Oh, great. Well, I have all these causes on Facebook, and one of them is Teach Empathy for Animals. And it's the most popular one with like 25,000 people signed up. It's even more popular than Empathy for Humans. So it's you're really tapping into something there.
Well, I think in a way it's easier. The animals don't talk back, so in some ways maybe it's easier to feel empathy for them because we get to be more imaginative even.
Well, okay, I wonder if we could just go back to wrap up. Is there any, perhaps you could say if there's any final things you would like to talk about, and then if we could go back and wrap up and maybe have some bullet points of what you feel that we covered about how to build a culture of empathy. So is there any final thought that you'd like to share?
Well, just two final thoughts. One is it's just been delightful to have this conversation with you, Edwin. So thank you so much for inviting me. And just that I encourage people to love themselves and others, and to really listen, and understand that we all have our own story, and that our story is right and other people's story is right, and we can use that as a base to build more understanding and work through problems and conflict creatively.
Okay.
I'm not sure I can do bullet points because I didn't keep an outline.
Yeah, we covered so many things. So kind of, as I recall from, we talked about intention. I guess it was kind of the self-empathy, have empathy for yourself. That it kind of starts with there, and kind of get empathy as well.
Yes.
Seemed to be kind of the real, and that kind of that whole process. Actually, kind of really went through that whole process. Get empathy from others. Have empathy for yourself. Charge your empathy batteries. The stories of empathy with others for conflict resolution and the creativity of empathy.
Yes, and I guess I would add to be willing. It starts, I think, with willingness to treat ourselves better and treat others better, willingness to listen, and to open our hearts just a little bit at a time as it feels safe, and then we can do the most amazing creative problem solving together.
Okay, well, great. We also have the conference coming up, so I hope you'll be a panelist on that. And
Love to.
I've just loved this. I'm really so glad that we were able to do this this dialogue on how to build a culture of empathy, because I really enjoyed it, and I get so much out of kind of talking about it, which is actually one of the things about empathy I see to start a culture of empathy is to dialogue, just to have these conversations and keep these conversations going. So I hope we can do that.
Oh, absolutely. It's so much more fun to be in dialogue and to bounce our ideas off each other. So thank you so much for this opportunity, Edwin.
See the world through other people's eyes. Empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.